Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, in this session today we are going to discuss on post-independence Hindi novels. Dear friends, it is very clear from the topic itself that we are going to discuss on how the Hindi novels were written after independence. For this, dear friends, we today have in our studios Dr. Anand Prakash. Dr. Prakash is a retired professor from Delhi University. He was a professor in the Department of English. So dear friends, let's take advantages from his experiences and try to understand and try to accumulate the information regarding the way the novels were written after independence. So welcome to the EduSet lecture, sir, once again, and I would like to tell all the students who might be watching us right now that Professor Prakash used to give us ample of knowledge which not only help us in studying our course material but also it helps us in widening our knowledges. So sir, welcome once again.
Thanks, Geetika, and welcome viewers. Today's topic is in India post-independence Hindi novel, and I have in mind, a kind of a view of the novel as it existed in the pre-independence period. In history and in social life, there are no clear-cut boundaries. There is a boundary which is well defined, of course. The boundary is the 1947 year when India became free. But then the things that existed before have continued more or less in the same manner. And if there are some new developments, that they are originated in events and happenings that were there either before or after or during the period that is 1947. So when I say post-independence Hindi novel, then what I mean is the trends that emerged in the 1950s, 60s and later, and which had their source in the pre-independence period, but which crystallized in a concrete form in the 1950s, 60s and later. Let me, by way of beginning the discussion, remind you about certain points that were made in another lecture with respect to novel writing in the pre-independence period. The major, in fact, the most important, fictional voice in fiction, in the longer fiction, which is a novel, was Premchand. And Premchand became a household name, and his novels were very entertaining and at the same time very educative. You see, with the passage of time, Premchand also, came up as a thinker and as a visionary, and people learnt a great deal from him. The way he wrote the novels, the way he presented characters, the way he stuck to the principle of reality, the way he picked up instances and situations from real life and changed them into the fictional form in his novels. So he, in the last analysis, was a writer who was in the realistic mode. The person who takes his inspiration, his ideas, and his vision from actual circumstances in which he lived. So that kind of writing was realistic writing, and one hoped, that when 1947 came, when Britishers left India, when India became independent, and would be forming then policies of our own, then this kind of a realistic mode would continue. And this is what one hoped, that writers in the post-independence period would be as realistic, as much referring to the real circumstance as Premchand was doing or his contemporaries earlier were doing. So this was the hope, and there were many writers who got inspired by Premchand, who carried the influence of Premchand in their fiction, and they continued with this. That is one trend. The second trend is that in the 1930s and 40s itself, another kind of emphasis also was there on the scene, and that emphasis was not as realistic in the sense in which Premchand was realistic, but which focused upon the problems of mind. So society, real circumstance, real problems belong to one category, and the realm of mind belongs to another. So what goes on in the mind of a character at a time when he or she takes a decision, when he or she expresses oneself, that thought process that mental process, that psychological kind of dimension is captured by, is picked up by a certain novelists in the pre-independence period. And this trend, which was parallel to the Premchand trend of realism, this also went into the next phase as the country became free. There were certain pressures after independence, and one pressure I've talked about in other discussions. That pressure was of a rising middle class, and this middle class was a product of the schools and colleges in the 1940s, and when 50s came, then this middle class had joined certain jobs, and cities were emerging in India in a different manner than before. New jobs were there, and new households had come up. So for this reason, people started more and more thinking about the life in the cities, and that took away from the kind of situations that Premchand picked up from rural life, from the village life. So this mode of the middle class life in the cities, that became a kind of a point of focus in the 1950s. That's a third trend. There is another trend, and I'll come back to all these trends one by one and talk about them in brief. There is another trend. Certain people, of course, all of them were products of the 1940s and 50s educational background, the resources and facilities, infrastructure, and these people became somewhat academic and self-conscious. And they, for instance, would say that instead of talking about the society as a whole, because that way you remain always broad, they would be talking about certain areas of life, certain areas of even geographical areas, because there a different kind of a culture persisted than the one that a person like Premchand would capture. So Premchand would talk about the nation. Premchand would talk about India as it was going in a certain direction, and these writers said that let India be alone, let it alone. We will talk about that reality which we know, that reality which we experience, that reality with which we are in touch. And since some of them would come from UP, some others would come from Madhya Pradesh, a third person would come from Rajasthan, a fourth would come from Punjab, etc. So they said they know only about the areas to which they belong, and they will talk about it in the novel, and will try to present it in as graphic a form as possible. So the word that they used to categorize their kind of writing was called regional novel, or the Hindi word was Anchalik. Anchal is region. So these writers talked about the region, and a region for them meant a peculiar language, a peculiar phraseology and vocabulary, and language meant a kind of expression of culture that had roots in the background from where the characters came, or from where the novelist himself or herself came. So this Anchalik novel was not there as much in the form in which it was there in the 1950s and 60s, and this was a more or less totally new thing in Hindi at that point of time, and it remained for some time. Well, these are the major 3 or 4 major trends, and I'll take them up in some detail now that I have spread the kind of net for us to consider. So those who wrote in the tradition of Premchand in the post-independence era were people like Yashpal. Yashpal had started writing in 1940s itself, and he became a major name then. He called himself, and he was a revolutionary writer and thinker. He was a Marxist. He had learned his art of writing from Premchand, but then he wanted to go forward. Premchand would stop at culture, would stop at certain ideas, and this person would say, I'll extend the scope of ideas and culture to the actual steps that a character or a particular situation, a character may take, or a particular situation may adopt. So he brought in those ideas which emanate from history. So he started offering kind of a discussion within the novel for the benefit of for the audience, for the readers. And he said that the experiences that the readers went through, and the experiences that in the realm of the novel the characters went through, they should be interpreted in such a manner that they are shown as going in the direction of change. So in fact, his novels, which were written around the time of partition and later, they were called things like he called his novel, one of the novels is Dada Comrade, another novel is called Party Comrade, a third novel is called Manushya Ke Roop. Manushya Ke Roop means that it's a man-centered, it's a human-centered novel, and he will talk about the changes that happen to a particular character in the course of time. And when the partition came, and he was a very close kind of, he had a chance to closely scrutinize the partition. He was from Punjab, he was from Lahore, and he saw this partition happening in front of his eyes, and he was deeply shaken by the events that were unfolding themselves before him in 1947. Before that, 1946 and 45, and since his reference was always history, it was always reality, and he was a kind of a descendant of Premchand, so he would look with open eyes at whatever was happening, and he was deeply saddened. So, the person who was shocked, who was saddened, who was pained, who was anguished, this was Yashpal at the time, and he wrote this famous novel called it is Jhootha Sach. The novel it's a big novel. It's a novel in 2 volumes. It appeared in 2 volumes, and the novel ran into more than 800 pages. And the novel was written in the late 50s and early 60s, and almost every Hindi reader of the time would talk about this novel. And it was a kind of extension of Premchand in the sense that he took up the political questions, he took up the cultural questions, he took up also the angles of young people, how they would interpret the relationship with one another, how they would establish households, how they would turn your lovers of a different kind. He will show all those things in a correct kind of proportion. And this novel even today is referred to as much as little less, but almost as much as it was referred to in the 1960s and later. So this is one of the best novels in the Premchand mode. Now, viewers, I don't have time to go into the parallelism that existed between Premchand and Yashpal. Yashpal, in spite of being a person who was openly on the side of change, slurred over certain things in his writing. I don't want to go into that. But then, so far as the novel's strength is concerned, whether it's Manushya Ke Roop or whether it's Jhootha Sach in the 1950s, this novel holds a mirror up to us. It tells us as to what actually happened in India and how this mass exodus of people of one community, the Muslim community, happened from India to Pakistan, and from of the Hindu community from Pakistan to India. And this very sharp uprooting of such a large number of people, that had its own dynamic, and India after partition would not remain the same as it had been there since times immemorial. So this is the kind of thing, and finally the question that is raised in this novel, and that enthuses us even today. He said that there is a difference between Watan. Watan is the place where you are born, to which you belong, whose culture you inherit, whose value system you imbibe, and whose thoughts and visions you are guided by. That is called Watan. So Watan is something to do with the motherland, and Desh is a country. It's a bigger country. You don't know which parts of India, which part of the country are inhabited by which kind of people. But then you have a new formation which is called the country, which is called Desh, and now you would belong to Desh more than to Watan. And there will be, if there is a kind of a conflict between Watan and Desh, Watan is the motherland where you are born, and Desh is that bigger entity of which you will be a part, of which you will be a citizen, and then you will be expected to behave in a certain manner as the citizen of the country. So in fact, Jhootha Sach is in 2 parts, and the first part is called Watan or Desh, and the second part is called Desh Ka Bhavishya. So this is the kind of novel that Hindi has seen, and I would definitely say that he did Premchand and Premchand's followers proud by writing this kind of a novel. Then there is another writer called Bhagwati Charan Verma. He also was in the Premchand mode, he didn't share his vision, with Premchand or with Yashpal for that matter, but then he was a good storyteller, and as a storyteller, he would tell, long narratives. He'll present, a whole, number of characters, and those characters will be different from one another. Then he will also go over the generations, so first generation, second generation, third generation, etc. And that way he would write his novels. I would call him, a person who is in the realistic mode, because his eye is all the time stuck, on the reality of the situation. So he picks up characters, he gives them views, more than conversation. He gives them views, and those views clash. And his views are not those of Premchand or of Yashpal. They are his own. And he seems to be, in his novels, a kind of a person who believes in balance and harmony. So, and his famous novel is Tedhe Medhe Raste, which is written around the same time, but which becomes quite famous. And he wrote a large number of novels even after India became free. And then this person was, I would place him in the category of Premchand and Yashpal, from the angle that he was referring all the time to an existing situation that he saw with his own eyes, to which he bore witness. Then of the same category, Yashpal, Bhagwati Charan Verma. Then I come to a third novelist called Amritlal Nagar, who was placed in Lucknow, and who lived all his life in Lucknow, and he knew the Lucknow culture very well. And at the same time, he was a good storyteller, and people, those who knew him, those who came in touch with him in Lucknow, they would say that he believed in some kind of what is called the pleasure of conversation. Now, the pleasure of conversation doesn't convey as much, but in Lucknow Hindi, if you talk of batras, then the kind of batras means conversation, pleasure of conversation. So he had that kind of batras in him. So he would create characters, and he would give them a language that would that will entertain the reader, because he will catch the nuances of language as they talk, as they converse with one another. And in his life also, he was some kind of a batras seeker, a person, a batras pursuer, and his vision was, his also method was sociological. He would talk about society, he would talk about problems. He would not be interested as much in very sharp ideas, as was the case with Yashpal or Bhagwati Charan Verma. He would just go into the social situations, and he will pinpoint the behavior of the characters, the way they conduct themselves. And because in the novel it is very difficult to keep people away from one another. In a novel, people have to come together. Therefore, novel is a social kind of a mode, social kind of a form, and a picture of society which is variegated, which has a kind of variety, which is a kind of multiplicity. The voice also is of multiplicity. There are different opinions, and all opinions remain together with one another. It's that kind of a writing that this person represents. And I would say that the novel was certainly taken forward from where it's as it started from Premchand, and you knew more about UP. You knew more about India's political developments. You knew more about other happenings, cultural happenings, etc. And one's horizon would be widened if one read Amritlal Nagar as a writer. His famous novel is called Boond aur Samudra, and the metaphor is that every individual is a kind of a boon, a drop, and Samudra is the ocean. So all of us together as drops constitute the ocean. So that's his philosophy. We have our individuality as drops, but then at the same time we together form what is called the country, the Samudra, or the nation. And he believed in the coexistence of all drops within the ocean. So that kind of a vision he had, and he also ruled the roost in the 1950s and 60s. He was almost as popular as Yashpal and Bhagwati Charan Verma, and he was in the old traditional mode. Then you had a writer who bordered on realism on one side and regionalism on the other. and he would be categorized with Yashpal, a writer who would always stick on to the realistic detail, and who would present a sharp point of view. This person's name is Range Raghav. His famous novel is Kab Tak Pukaru, but then he wrote a large number of novels, and in each novel he would take up certain aspects of life and he would depict them. Particularly in Kab Tak Pukaru, he would talk about the life of the nomads, people who have no place to live, who move from one place to another. They could be called gypsies, and he had such a great knowledge of the society of his time, and of the languages and dialects that he would depict. He would tell the reader that this is the kind of language, this is the kind of word use that exists in the language. So he would say all those things, and then his novels were very interesting. At the same time, they were very educative, because when you read the novel, then you get to know about Rajasthan, you get to know about Uttar Pradesh, you get to know about other areas, and then he definitely would be taking the tradition of Premchand and Yashpal forward, in the sense that he will of course not give the range of Premchand or Yashpal, but then he would create characters which were you can call them actual real characters as representatives of what can be called material reality. So that way, Range Raghav, of course, he died very early, because of which he could not give his best, and he had a great sense of vigor and stamina as he wrote, and he must have written more novels than almost any other writer in Hindi. But then he remained he had great potential, and one is sure that if he had lived for another 15-20 years, then he would have given many more and still more important novels. Then you have a writer from Eastern UP. This person's name is Bhairav Prasad Gupta, and he wrote a large number of novels. He was the great editor of the post-independence period. He edited 2 magazines, Kahani and Nayi Kahaniyan, and people know him more as an editor. But then on the sides, he was writing regularly novels, and he was very self-abnegating. He would not promote himself through his magazine that he was editing, but then he was all the time writing novels, and he must have at least 10 novels, if not more, and all of them big novels, novels of large descriptions. And for instance, his novel Dharti is very important. His novel Ganga Maiya is very important. He loves his land, he loves his rivers, he loves the peasants and workers of the country, and he's a Marxist writer like Yashpal. And today, of course, as people know him more and more as a writer after his death, then they realize that he was able to capture that India which was forming itself in the process of attaining independence. So India has become free, and there are people in the novel who know that India was a colony in the pre-1947 period, and those people have lived on to become free citizens in 1950s and 60s, and how they behave, how they watch the scene, how they interpret the scene, how they make their own lives, whether they fail, whether they succeed, etc. All this is very graphically captured by his novels. And being a Marxist writer, he would talk about productivity, he would talk about struggle, he would talk about people getting together. In his novels, as in Premchand's novel, you would have scenes of rallies, scenes of debates, etc. And if there is a person who has gone to a village to talk to the masses, then he will imagine a person standing in front of the village audience and talking to them. And maybe sometimes the lecture is as long as, not as long of course, but it would be at least 3 or 4 pages. And in those lectures, he would make the character talk about the actual problems of the audience that he faces. So that way, his novels, well, if you read his novels today, then you can know that this is how India existed in the 1950s and 60s. And in certain novels, he takes us back to the 1920s or so, because he was born himself in the second decade of the 20th century, and he saw India in the 1930s in particular and later also. And when you see a particular country, you don't just see with your own eyes, but also through the eyes of those people whom you meet. So if you are a 20-year-old person and you are talking to a 40-year-old person, then you know much more about India of the earlier 20 years, which you have not seen, through the eyes of that person who is 40 years at that time. So in fact, Bhairav Prasad Gupta's novels tell you the true picture, the realistic picture of India from 1900 onwards, up to the time that he is writing the novel. So we are lucky that we have these writers, in the Premchand mode. The writers, the first writer, the pioneer, the father of Hindi novel is Premchand. And if you read the novels of these 4 or 5 people, then you are acquainted with the entire 20th century life, at least in the northern part of India, which is the Hindi heartland. And I think we are very lucky that we have these novels and these novelists with us. And if we read them, then in a way we are reading the history of India in the 20th century. And how much one would wish that novels existed in the 19th century and in the 18th century, so that we knew what actually was there at that point of time. But we are not that lucky. We are not like the English people who had great novelists, not only in the 19th century but also in the 18th century. And our novel belongs to the 20th century itself. But then let's count our blessings that we have in 20th century a large number of writers who will take inspiration from actual circumstances, and who will give out through their writing for the benefit of the reader those details which otherwise the readers might have missed. So this is one stream, and I thought I should take some time talking about them, and that's why I have gone in some detail regarding this particular trend. But let me tell you, viewers, that this trend was a continuation of the pre-1947 trend, and that it flowered for some time till the 1960s. It was very much there. Yashpal, of course, kept on writing more and more novels, and one could see a kind of change in his writing. He died, I think, in the 1970s, and he was there till that time. But then his magnum opus, his biggest novel, had appeared in the 1950s, Jhutha Sach, and then he continued, of course. But then you would find that this realistic mode is being more and more challenged by other writers in the 1950s and 60s. And now I'll tell you about the way in which this particular mode was challenged by another stream of writing. So I talked about the psychological novel earlier, and this had struck roots in the pre-independence period. And two people come to mind straight away. One is Jnanendra Kumar and S.H. Vatsan, and these writers in their different ways. Jnanendra Kumar would be much more psychologically oriented. He will go into the processes, and S.H. Vatsan was a poet, a person who also knew the mind of the character, and a person who had a different kind of a vision than Jnanendra Kumar. Jnanendra Kumar would be talking about the actual psychological reality. So his novels would be categorized as novels of psychological realism. But so far as S.H. Vatsan is concerned, he was more in the modernist mode, where you talk about experience, and through that experience you create a kind of intensity, and then that experience and that intensity replaces ideas. So he is closer to modernism, but then he uses the mode of the psychology there, and his famous novel is Shekhar Ek Jeevni. And Shekhar Ek Jeevni is a big novel. It's written in the 1940s. It's in 2 parts, and this novel is still quite famous. But then this kind of a perspective that S.H. Vatsan built up in this novel, which was a few years before the country became free, this perspective could not last for a long time. How long could you present an experience of an individual? And when the experience was of the writer himself, and he called himself Shekhar in his novel. His name was Sachidanand Vatsan, but in his novel the hero is Shekhar, whose Jeevni, whose biography he is presenting. So then he could not perhaps continue with that in the same intensity that could be created in the first novel. So after that he wrote 2 or 3 novels, but then he majorly shifted to the domain of poetry. So I'll not go much into it. So far as Janendra Kumar is concerned, he started as a perceiver of psychological reality, but he went more and more into the philosophical mode. He became a kind of a philosopher in his novels, and initially his novels were very short. Sometimes the novel would be just 70-80 pages, another time it would be 100 pages. Then the maximum length of the maximum pages in the early novels, which for which he is known, that would be around 200 pages. But then after independence, as he went on writing, he would write sometimes 500 pages, 600 pages. And one of his novels, Mukti Bodh, is supposed to be a long novel, and you can see that he is turning more and more into a philosopher. So realistic mode becomes weak and is replaced in the 1960s and 70s by another kind of writing. But then this tradition that started also in the pre-independence period, this goes either in the direction of experience and modernity, or it goes in the direction of philosophy. So viewers, I have so far told you about that particular category which had its roots in the pre-independence period, but which more or less flawed in the 1950s and so, and it played its role, and finally the trend weakened. Now, this specifically post-independence novel, which whose roots could not be very clearly traced into the previous period, I already told about this. That's the regional novel in the first place. So the first major regional novel that appeared in the 1950s was Phanishwarnath Renu's Mela Aanchal. So the novel, Aanchal means Pradesh, Aanchal means Up Pradesh, Aanchal means the region, and he was talking about the northern part of Bihar region. And he picked up a small village, he picked up a small area around that village, and he tried to show the picture of India, a picture of Gandhi, for instance, picture of India in the 1950s in its miniature details. But then as the novel progresses, Mela Aanchal becomes a kind of a bigger picture, a kind of a metaphor for the country as a whole. And one realizes that there's more violence now, there is more corruption in life at that point of time, and people are turning into double dealers, and they are losing grip on idealism, etc. And the novel saddens at in many parts. The novel disturbs in other parts, and it's a problematic novel, because after all he has named the novel also as Mela Aanchal. It has been tainted. It's not as clean as one expected the Aanchal to be. And there is a play on the word Aanchal. Aanchal also is a kind of shawl or dupatta for the woman, or for the country who can be seen as a woman. Then the Aanchal is one part of the body of the woman, the covering of the woman, and that Aanchal is Mela, that is tainted, it is polluted, it is dirtied. So when he calls this Aanchal dirtied, then the social evils, the social problems come in, and he is able to present them directly in that sense. Now, another peculiarity of this novel, Mela Aanchal, and other novels by him, and the other great novel written by him is Parti Parikatha. In these novels, what he is saying is that the country is going from bad to worse, and there doesn't seem to be much hope. That kind of idealism which existed earlier in the country during the national movement, that can be recaptured. That process of idealism can be reversed. He doesn't think so. But then he is using for his expression not the standard Hindi. That's one difference, with the Anchalic writing, the regional writing, and the mainstream Hindi writing. Premchand, could easily write in Bhojpuri or in Avdi. He knew Bhojpuri quite well, and he must have also spoken Bhojpuri in his actual life. He knew Urdu very well, and he shifted both from Bhojpuri and from Urdu to Hindi. Why did he do it? Premchand, starts his language at home is Bhojpuri, and his language, of expression is Urdu. But gradually he is shifting from both and writing in standard Hindi, which he doesn't know enough sufficiently. And for that he might be taking help from somebody to turn his Urdu novels into some kind of Hindi, particularly at the level of vocabulary. Now that's one trend, that the writer wants to change from a smaller scope language language which has a smaller scope, to a language which is available to a wider audience is one kind of writing. And in the case of Renu, the opposite has happened. He knows Hindi very well, and he knows the dialect very well, but he consciously leaves Hindi and expresses himself in the language of his region, which is part Bihar, part Eastern Uttar Pradesh, and he uses words, and sometimes the dialogues are not available to the ordinary Hindi reader. Well, I would refer to his short story for you to read. The novel is difficult to read. It's a longish description, and there is a lot of vocabulary that is unfamiliar for the reader. But at least viewers try to read a short story called Tisri Kasam, on which a film also is based, and you realize how difficult this dialect can be for the common Hindi reader. But then this was a peculiarity to which the post-independence Hindi fiction, particularly writers of novels, belonged. They would take words from the regions, the unfamiliar words, and then they would use them in order to present the coloring of the locale, and that's what they would call their contribution to the writing of fiction. Of course, there are precedents in the Western world also of people taking to dialects for expressing themselves. I can give one or two examples just to explain. Dickens sometimes uses the dialect, uses a dialect, and that dialect is put into the mouth of characters. And sometimes it's very difficult to follow certain characters in Dickens, because they would not talk in standard English. Then you have a writer called Walter Scott in the early 19th century, who uses the Scottish dialect in his English novels. So when it comes to that, then of course it's very difficult to understand as to what the character says. And another example is that of Hardy. Hardy also uses a dialect, not exactly English in some parts of the novels, but also the dialect. So maybe some idea of the use of the dialect for expressing fictional reality in fiction came from the examples from English novels or from the Western novels. But then these people had to somehow make a differentiation from the mainstream Hindi writing and see their identity as expressed through their own dialect. And coming back to Mela Aanchal finally emerges as a kind of a tale of love, and that love, of course, is surrounded by all kinds of social forces, and that novel doesn't exactly come to that kind of fulfillment that the author may have planned for the characters, etc. And it's all problematic, and the novel is ending on a note of sentiment. But then Renu was a big name in the 1950s and 60s. Of course, he lived till 1970s, and he had a political vision. He was a socialist, and he also took part in the socialist movement in the pre-independence period, and even in the period that followed. And one can see this socialist politics, and by socialism I don't mean Marxist socialist politics. What I mean is the Indian socialist politics. He was a member of a socialist party and in India, and he was a very close follower of Jayaprakash Narayan. So that politics is there in his novels, as there is a politics in Range Raghav's novels, or as there is a politics in Yashpal's novels. But this politics remains in the background, and the characters are more or less experiential. They feel sad, they feel happy, they are lyrical, etc., and that is more important. So this is how the regional novel is to be understood. I have already given the example of Range Raghav, who is a regional novelist, and there are many others at that time. It's a trend, and anybody who comes from a particular place will take up the life, the chunk of life from that place, depict it through a language which the characters appearing in it would speak in real life, and that's how this novel remains alive in the latter half of the 1950s up to the middle of the 1960s. Later on, of course, you can say that dialect is being used. For instance, there is a writer who used dialect all the time, but then he would temper that dialect with mainstream Hindi, like the great poet Nagarjuna, he also wrote a number of novels, and he's writing about the Indian village, and there is speaking of the dialect of India's village, and the villagers are given a chance to express themselves, particularly women characters in his case are given a chance to express themselves. But then Nagarjuna, being a Marxist writer, he keeps in mind that the word is to be used in such a manner that the message gets across to the reader. So that way you have even a Nagarjuna who uses the dialect, but then that dialect is used in order to communicate the meaning and sweeten it further, just by bringing it close to the surface of life. So viewers, this is what we have covered so far. We have covered the Premchand tradition, we have covered this psychological philosophical tradition, and we have also covered this regional writing that happened in the 1950s and 60s. And now there are certain things that were happening in Hindi at that time at the level of ideas, at the level of perspectives. For instance, there were great movements in Hindi at that point of time, and all these movements use the word new. So there was something old and this is new. So there is a nayi kavita, there is a kavita, there is a nayi kavita. There is a kahani, there is a nayi kahani. There is an upanyas and there is a naya upanyas. And since we are discussing today the upanyas, the novel, then we have to see a new novel here also. And it's amusing to see that this kind of a thing was there exactly at that time in Europe also. That and for instance, there would be an anti-novel. So here it would be there can be a novel called upanyas nahi. And in poetry, particularly anti-poetry was there in Europe, and here you had akavita. So not kavita but akavita, and because they had anti-story there, so you also have akahani here. And it so happened that these people who were akavis or akahanikars or an anti-novel, they started thinking of writing novel themselves. Some of the akahanikars, people who wrote akahani, they also started writing novels, and this was the trend of the 1960s. When the nayi kavita had exhausted itself in terms of meaning, then the akavita came forward. So there are certain writers who are nayi kavi, and they are also writing novels. I can just name a few. For instance, I'll not talk about the nayi kavi. Of course, they are there. Raghuveer Sahir, for instance, would think of writing a longish short story, if not a novel. But you have Mohan Rakesh, who is a nayi kahani writer. He's put in that category, and he is not happy with just a kahani to write. Therefore, he might write a novel also. And he wrote a novel, in 1960s. The novel is called Andhere Band Kamre. It's a novel, of 300 pages or so. And Rakesh also wrote, very longish short stories, Lambi Kahaniyan. But then this novel is another novelistic version of the same Lambi Kahani. So if you have a kahani of 40 pages, then you can have a novel also of 300 pages. And the situations are the same and the characters are similar. And therefore, it's the short story, it's the story expanded into the scope of the novel. So this is what he did. And I can also interpret and comment upon this Andhere Band Kamre. So imagine Andhera is one thing, but Andhera Kamra can have doors that you can cross and go out into the open. But then it's a closed room. So there are rooms and they are closed, and the person is trapped in them. So they are using the metaphor of the middle class. They are using the metaphor of the Indian citizen who doesn't have any scope of progress anywhere and who is stuck. He cannot go back to the past, cannot go into the future, and the present is closed. Therefore, he'll be stuck there, and he is waiting. As the existentialist would say in Europe at that time, life is a sickness unto death, and that can be easily translated as Andhere Band Kamre. That's a kind of a sickness, and you are closed in the room, and finally you will be suffocated and you will die. Then there is a poet. He's a Nayi Kavita poet, but he also writes short stories, and he also wrote a novel called Gunahon Ka Devta. This person is Dharmveer Bharti, and he wrote this novel in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And here, you can see Gunahon ka Devta, that it's a god, which is of sins. So a sinful god. So one can't really make sense of this. How can a god, be sinful? But then he is thinking of a gunah that turns into a kind of godliness. This person starts glorifying a person who is sinful. Anyway, I am not going to the theme of the novel. I'll simply say, that it's about an experience. Their experiences of sin, or it's considered to be a sin, and the person is trying to come out of that sinfulness and doesn't succeed. But then his struggle to come out of that sin is a kind of struggle, heroic struggle. Therefore, one can call him a devta. Of course, he's talking about a person who considers his teacher's daughter as a sister, but then he also loves her, and he has a kind of relationship with her. It's a guna. The teacher's daughter is somebody's sister, and then he's going against himself. He's going against his grain of morality, and he's establishing that kind of closeness with her, and that's how this novel is built up. Then you have Rajendra Yadav. He's a writer of Nai Kahani, but he also writes novels. There is a famous novel on which there is in Hindi a film was made. It's called Sara Akash. Originally it was a novel. He also wrote a novel before this, which is called Ukhade Hue Log. Then his wife Manu Bhandari, in her own right, a short story, a Nai Kahani writer, and she wrote novels like Mahabhoj. You have Nirmal Verma, who wrote Nai Kahani, who also wrote short novels. You have Markandeya, who wrote, I'm just naming a few writers, who were writing novels just under the pressure of being short story writers and then thinking of expanding the experience in such a manner that it finally became a novel. So all these people tried their hand at the bigger fiction, the longer fiction, even though initially they were all writers of short stories. And this all short story writers trying their hand at a novel and succeeding or not succeeding, but then giving out novels to the audience. So one would say that this trend also has continued into the 1970s and later. Now, people who were at that point of time, had their formative period and who became writers in 1970s and 80s, they carried these influences in their bones, in their blood. And when they turned to writing, then they would take some seeds from the experience and the practices of the 1950s and 60s, and they would add something of their own from their experiences of the 1970s and 80s, and that will somewhat change the nature and form of the novel, and at the same time there will be some connection kept with the earlier tradition. I am referring here particularly to writers such as Giriraj Kishore, who would be writing in the 1960s first. Then there is a person called Pankaj Bisht. There is another person called Asghar Wajahat. There is a writer called Sanjeev. There is a lady called Maitreyi Pushpa. These people also tried their hand at novels. They were writing short stories initially. Some of them would write poetry, but then they would also write novels. What made these people write novels? Is a question that can be raised. Why should they write novels when initially they started as short story writers and their main, their forte, their main field of activity was the short form, the kahani, and one can say that they wanted to capture in the novel a bigger chunk of reality than they could do in the short story. So in the short story, generally you have one character and his or her aura or his or her strength to capture. But then if you want to increase the scope of the short story further, then you can bring in 4 or 5 characters who interact with one another and who presented a bigger picture of the same reality that the short story tried to capture. So maybe that's one reason. Another reason could be a little more commercial, a reason much more popular, in the sense that this is the case these days in Hindi, that if you write a short story, very few buy the short story collections. So if you approach a publisher and say, please publish my short stories, then the publisher might suggest to you, instead of short stories, give us a novel. So some writers think, that okay, in order to get published, they should write a novel. So some of them start writing novels. Some start, in fact, some end up as writing good novels, better novels than they did short stories. So finally, they become novelists. I'm particularly referring to Asghar Bajat, who started as a short story writer, but then he had a chance to write a novel, and then he wrote not just one, but 3 or 4 novels, and of course plays. But I'm not talking about plays now. So. What do these writers in the 1970s and 80s do in the novels? What kind of novels are these? Are they realistic novels? Are they novels of psychological reality? Are they novels of the regional kind? This is a question that we have to consider. And my answers are that in the 1950s India is of one kind, in 1917 and 18 it's of another kind. In 1950 you have just one party rule all over the country. In 1970s and 80s, you have seen lots of upheavals. There are big discussions about social reality, and writers also take part in them, and therefore they become sometimes confused. Sometimes they want to talk about different things. Sometimes they go lyrical, etc. So they are in the 1970s trying to carry the effects and the burden of their own decades, and for this reason, when they write novels, then they allow these particular aspects to enter their novels and enrich them or problematize them. That's one to consider. But then one thing that particularly separates the novel of the 1970s and 80s from the earlier novel, that is 50s and 60s, is that now there is a bigger kind of emphasis on women characters, and there are a large number of women also who have taken to writing in the 1980s and 90s. And these women, were educated in the schools and colleges. They became aware of their problems. They wanted to write about their own life, their own experiences, and some of them had the now guts to make writing a career. And like Prabha Khetan, like Maitreyi Pushpa, I already mentioned. There are of course women writers of great strength in Hindi in the post-independence period. And I can particularly mention Krishna Sobti in that connection. Sobti, who was quite mature and evolved as a writer in the 1950s also. But then, as time passed, she became more and more assertive in her writing and became a bold person. One of the finest voices of women's writing in particular, and of writing in general. And she would not merely write novels or short stories, she would also write critical tracts of a kind, and she is still going strong with her interventions, etc. So this trend that Krishna Sobti may have started in her own individual way in the 1950s and 60s, this has added strength to what happened in the 1980s and 90s, and I think in her late 80s or early 90s, Krishna Sobti is still a name to reckon with. And she can intervene effectively, and she can sometimes reverse certain negative trends in Hindi culture and writing. So she is a novelist of her own kind. So you have, well, finally, I would say that the novel in the post-independence Hindi is starting from a point. I already told you the points, Premchand, etc., and then getting a kind of weakening somewhere or the other. And today also, the novel, I forgot to mention one more name. There is a kind of intellectual novel that has a presence in Hindi, and the example is of the Bhagwan Singh of 1960s and 70s, who wrote 2 very important novels, in those decades, and they seem to be intellectual in the sense that he is going into the intellectual nature of the characters that he is analyzing, that he is representing, that he is recreating or constructing in his novel. So in one novel, he is creating the character of Buddha, Gautam Buddha, and Gautam Buddha in the modern circumstances. He is visualizing him, and he is writing a wonderful novel. It's called Mahabhishak, and the second novel, that I enjoyed even more was Ram Ke Naam. It was called Apne Apne Ram, and there he created this mythical, this historical or semi-historical character called Ram into a living character, And the pleasant, the good pleasing thing was that when he wrote this Apne Apne Ram novel, then he somehow centralized the character of Kaikeyi, who is some kind of bad presence, an evil presence in Ramayana and all. But here she has a presence, and he tries to give writerly sympathy to this character. So you have this kind of intellectual novels also in Hindi. There are many other examples. Manohar Shyam Joshi has a still different kind of a novel, and he can be called the novel of magical realism. You have these writers in Hindi. So it's a plethora of novels. It's a great variety of novels. But then I would say that most of these novels are written under the pressure of either appeals that come from the publishers or influences that travel from the Western countries, some kind of examples and experiments that are done there, and then as the possibility of a new kind of a novel is exhausted, then we will start thinking of other possibilities. But on the whole, I would say, as I wind up the discussion, that novel has weakened from its initial strong form in the 1940s and 50s, and today novel doesn't have that kind of appeal that it had earlier. You have novelists, but there's not a single novelist who can be household name in the sense in which Premchand or Yashpal or Rangi Raghav or others whom I mentioned, Renu for instance, would be. So you have a large number of novelists, and they are experimenting in the field of feminism, in the field of other interests. But then novel is not as strong a presence in Hindi writing today as for instance poetry is, as in fact short stories, as even criticism is. And that maybe I could go theoretically into this if time permitted, but since there is no time, so I would say that one should recognize that as a trend, the novel in Hindi has weakened in the last 15-20 years. So this should be gone into, maybe it's a separate topic of discussion and somebody should take it up. So I finish with this, and if there is something that you would like to say about this in the last minute or so.
So in the last minute, as I have gone through all the lecture and listened you very keenly, one thing has come out that regionalism was there. That's why sometimes when we flip the pages of these novels, somewhere or the other we find the dialect which was, for example, if a story is about a village, then of that particular village or that particular region, the dialect could well be can be read out, and from there we can predict, yes, that this was the era when this novel was written. So do you feel so? Yes, regionalism in the form of the dialect could well be predicted when we read these novels today also.
Yes, that's quite true. Regionalism in writing also helps establish a particular trend of culture, and that's the positive aspect. And it is for this reason that people started talking of their own dialects in their own regional experiences. And of course, in the overall country, there are all kinds of varieties of people and experiences, and all should be welcome in the field of the novel, because novel is more or less a picture of the society around in which it exists. So regionalism is an important factor, and even today, when one has to think of variety, and there is an illiterate person or there is a woman, etc., then the vocabulary of the writer changes. Because then the writer has to say, if a child is made to speak and if a child belongs to Punjab, then there have to be certain words which are peculiar to Punjab, etc. So that is quite valuable. So I agree with you on this.
Yes, sir. With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving your precious time, as well as making us aware about the various novelists as well as their novels. Dear friends, if you have any queries, you can mail us at info.cec@nic.in, so that the next time when Dr. Anand Prakash visits our studio, we would love to solve your queries in form of your mails. And if you want to access this particular lecture, you can access it with the help of YouTube, as we daily say that we upload these lectures only for you so that you can access them ample of times. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.